Hi, welcome back. In this final lecture, and what I consider the most important related to fleet, in terms of you being an EMS manager, is I want to spend some time and talk about replacement scheduling. Now, with replacement scheduling, it's important to understand that an old fleet can actually cost an organization more money. Now, you probably have an intuitive sense of that as an employee if you've spent much time working on the front lines as a paramedic, because often you run into the cost components of that, the broken down vehicles, the increased amount of maintenance, the in-fuel increase or decrease in fuel efficiency, all of those factors. So we want to spend just a little bit of time and think about it, and think about what you potentially could do to try to improve the situation in your organization of using fleets that are outdated. One of the things, when you look at the cost of a fleet, you see here a representation of a spreadsheet that compares the capital cost to operating costs and summarizes that as total cost, and then it looks at it in terms of short and long term. One of the things you'll note that I just mentioned is that the maintenance and repair costs increase pretty dramatically with the number of miles actually placed on a vehicle. What you'd like to do in your organization is try to document this as much as possible. To rectify the situation, what you need to do is to create a schedule of replacing the vehicles at a point that's optimal. Well, what is that optimal point? Well, there's actually an economical theory related to vehicle replacement. It's basically just the microeconomic perspective in relation to supply and demand that you can see in these cost curves. Here you see the cost curves associated with operating costs, capital costs, and total costs. And what you'll note is that the total cost curve is minimized or optimized at the point where there's a junction between the operating costs and the capital costs. Well, how do you get to that? Well, you're going to have to collect some data in your system to be able to plot these two components. What you'll find, again, is that as the cost of maintenance starts to increase, or your operating cost increases, it makes more sense to actually look at replacing the fleet. So again, here are the major components to include a part of that analysis. You want to look at the capital cost, which of course is the purchase cost, the labor cost, the residual cost. You want to look at the operating cost in terms of maintenance and repairs and fueling. Again, fuel cost probably increases as a vehicle gets older, as fuel efficiency decreases. And then you want to look at other costs that may be associated, such as the acquisition costs, or the cost to you of disposing of a salvaged vehicle. You may also want to look at things like registration fees and taxes that will be associated with adding new vehicles, if that would affect you in any way. And of course, any other things that you can derive to put in to make this analysis more formal would be worthwhile. When you think about sources of vehicle data, you can get those from multiple places. You can get them from sometimes vehicle and fuel purchase processes can return some of the data for you in terms of what your maintenance and repairs and the fuel costs are, in terms of looking at cost of operation over the long term and how that's actually going to affect the analysis. Because again, remember that fuel cost is not the same today. So when we're looking at fuel efficiency and we're trying to project what's going to take place in a year with a vehicle given a certain number of mileage or certain number of miles placed on that vehicle, we need to look at how we're going to actually make that adjustment for things like fuel costs. One of the ways to do that is actually to use an inflation factor. The inflation factor that works best for transportation is actually the Transportation Consumer Price Index. Normally, as we've talked about in the financial management course, or you will talk about in the financial management course, in terms of looking at net present values, one of the things you have to do is actually discount back. It's called discounting. Discount back funds. So in going through the discounting process and actually trying to adjust for inflation, the consumer price index is one of the best predictors that we have. More specifically, when we're talking about transportation issues such as your fleet, the transportation consumer price index is actually the best index to use for that. And again, you usually have some in-house data that can provide information on some of the other factors. When it comes to residual value of vehicles, you can get data from several different places. Again, you're going to want to try to predict what the salvage value is because that's going to be an important component of the calculation. So you may want to look at used ambulance vendors and see what comparable vehicles with comparable miles are actually selling for. You may want to look at blue or black book values in terms of used cars if you've got vehicles that aren't ambulances. You might want to look at auto lease guides and see what the residual guidebooks are pricing cars at or vehicles at. And then, of course, there are other services that you can to pull into play if need be. And looking at this optimal, again, we want to look at the replacement cycle and actually predict that based on the amount of savings that we could actually realize in terms of the annual total fleet savings or cost. Now, there are some calculations that can help with this, and I'll actually later post to the portal a spreadsheet, much like the one for inventory control, that actually has some of these built in so you can see how it actually works. But in terms of thinking about optimal vehicle replacement, here you can see a formula for that. When we think about the equivalent annual cost, it's actually a stream of cash flows. And when we think about the net present value, it's the present value of the stream of those cash flows. And as I mentioned, there's a discount rate factor that's involved, and we have to subtract from that inflation. So in terms of that, we want to look at it over a period of years. Now, don't worry a lot about this equation, because in the financial management course, we'll actually talk about it in more depth and actually doing the calculations in terms of thinking about what that return value is. What we're really interested in here is the graph you saw earlier of trying to determine where that point is that the operating cost and the capital costs cross each other and trying to determine optimal number of vehicles. Again, it's going to differ for every organization because the number of miles you place on the vehicles and the projected length of the vehicles is actually going to change over time. So in terms of thinking about a long-term replacement strategy, the thing I want to emphasize here with fleet, us talking about fleet, is that you really want to work and try to determine what this optimal replacement cycle is. From that, you want to conduct an in-depth cost-benefit analysis and try to project what the potential savings would be from actually replacing your fleet at the optimal time. In doing that, ideally you would create a policy that you would bring forth to either your senior executives or to your public officials to get buy-in to actually create and implement the schedule, as opposed to making every potential vehicle a capital acquisition, as is normally done in most budgeting processes. In doing that, what you do is you take the political nature out of it to a large extent. So instead of going to, as an example, your city council or county commission to replace a vehicle each time, instead of doing that, you actually have a plan in place that calls for that replacement of a vehicle at a certain time, and it automatically becomes part of the purchasing process. The other thing that can be done is if you're working in a public entity, you can actually have a fund balance that is created to aggregate funds in that balance over time and to actually utilize those funds for those purchases. So it doesn't become a normal capital outlay, even though in reality it is, it may show up that way on the books. It's not in terms of a one-time decision to make a purchase. So it takes a lot of the political heat out of a public official making that determination to buy a vehicle or not buy a vehicle. Now, in doing that, it's great to create this replacement strategy. However, you have to think about an implementation and mitigation plan. How are you going to put it in place? Or I should say migration plan. How are you going to put it in place? How are you going to implement this over a period of time? It's usually not something you can implement in the course of a year. There may be a 5-year implementation cycle of actually getting the system up to par. And that really, again, is dependent on where your fleet is today and how optimal the vehicles are you have for utilization. Well, when we think about other cost reduction strategies that could exist, there's multiple things. Of course, the smaller the fleet, the lower our cost. Our ability to control that is fairly low because the number of vehicles that we require is actually based on the volume and the staffing requirements that we have based on the demand analysis that we did over the last couple weeks. So we have to integrate all of these pieces to determine the optimal size of our fleet and then determine the optimal number of vehicles we need to supply that number of vehicles on the street at any one point in time. We can do things to reduce the miles traveled, and some people think that a good way to do that is to actually not do posting, but unfortunately that doesn't pan out. Posting plans usually reduced overall costs instead of increasing because the thing that will happen is to meet response time requirements you'll need many more vehicles if you don't do posting, and you'll have a decrease in productivity. So you have to balance all of these factors, and it's actually somewhat art in addition to the science behind it. So you have to put both of those components together and try to create a balance in your organization. So here you see some of the other factors associated with trying to decrease costs. And you see on the list, the thing that stands out the most, the reduced vehicle life cycle cost, that is a factor that, as you see to the right, we have high control over in actually trying to create the optimal replacement schedule for our vehicles and decrease the associated costs with not doing that. Well, I'll stop there for this week. If you have specific questions, please post them to the Facebook group, and I look forward to seeing you next week.